Hello there and welcome to another edition of the Rest is Policing podcast. My name is Martin Buhagiar. I'm joined as ever by Lee Broadbent. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Martin.
And we've got a special guest this evening, so welcome to Steve Thornton. Nice to have you joining us, Steve. Welcome.
Well, thanks for the invite, Martin, and nice to meet up with you, Lee, as well. I know we've had many communications.
Yes.
Well, we'll come on to that now. I think what we could probably do is maybe to begin with, Steve, just in case people aren't aware of you, rather than me tell everyone about you, it'd probably be useful if you tell people a bit about yourself, your history, and what you're doing now, if that works for you.
Okay. I mean, most people say, "Oh, well, I know work for some like clean easy company," but I admit to being a former Metropolitan police officer and spent 36 years in the Met. The vast majority of that time was in the Specialist Firearms Command. So I originally retired back in 2013 as a police officer. Went to live in Devon for a couple of years and was a proper beach mum until the Met sort of gave me a phone call and said, do you want to come back? We're a bit short of firearms instructors. I've got a feeling it was my wife who made the phone call to get rid of me. She was fed up of seeing me. So I went back to the Met in 2016 as a civilian police firearms instructor. And being a civilian, it sort of opened up a few other doors for me, which we'll come on to as to how sort of Trojan Wellbeing came about. One of my remits was looking after the welfare of colleagues who've been involved in police shootings, obviously quite topical with what's been going on recently, certainly with NX121 and a couple of my other colleagues from SO19. So that's a bit about my policing background. As I said, through my work with colleagues, it was just like a natural progression to sort of put in place welfare support, which was sadly missing. Lots of flag waving going on, saying we're doing this, that, and the other. But when you actually scratch the surface, people were being left at home, broken police officers with no real support, and family members weren't being looked after. So hence, Trojan Wellbeing started to sort of come about to provide that additional support and actually provide a bit of early intervention as well, because lots of people were wandering around, certainly the firearms training centre, and you could see that they were stressed and there was sort of the telltale signs, and just having a conversation with someone, just saying, are you okay? Really opened up my eyes to sort of what was going on. So then, that's how Trojan Wellbeing came about, really. So yeah, and the rest is history, really.
How long ago was it that you set Trojan Wellbeing up? How many years are we talking?
So 5 years now. So it's been running for 5 years. So it was actually set up whilst I was still serving as a civilian firearms instructor. Because I became a mental health first aider within the Met, helped set up the blue light sort of champion network for the other firearms commands. So it was just a natural progression from there, really.
Well, congratulations. It's been absolutely successful, hasn't it? One thing I've got to ask, though, Steve, is before we continue, obviously, your nickname's Lobby, isn't it? Is there a story you can share about that? Is it?
Yes. So when I first joined the police, way back in 1983, I joined the relief at Battersea, South London. There were 4 Steves on the relief, and the police being the police, they like nicknames, and it was during one sort of particular debrief in the sort of like the CID office across the road, when we're having a few beers, that we're just chatting about my favourite food. And my favourite food was lobby. I'm originally from Bolton in Lancashire. I know it's now Greater Manchester, I know that, but it was Lancashire when I was born, and I stick to being a Lancastrian. So lobby is an old sort of meal that my gran used to make, just all the leftovers, put in a pot, bubbled away throughout the week, and that was it. It's like comfort food, really. So I said lobby was my sort of food. So that was it. It stuck with me. There's people I've worked with for over 36 years. Don't even know my first name is Steve. Do you know Steve Thornton? I've never heard of him. Oh, what about Lobby Thornton? Oh, yeah, I know that idiot. Yeah.
Well, I had the same conversation with Lee when Lee said Lobby's joining us. I was like, who's Lobby? I was like, is that Steve Thornton? Or is that? I thought it was someone else. Yeah. I mean, with a surname like Buhagiar, I've got my first nickname was Gizzer, and which is a very long story, which I won't go into. But I've got friends, college friends, and school friends whose wives still call me Gizzer and don't actually know I'm Martin.
Yeah.
And my name in the last few years has been Badger because of Buhagiar, and I've got so many nicknames. So yeah,
Gray as well.
Well, I don't know. I think they're not too bad actually. Yeah. I've got a couple on the beard now. That's just stress. What about you, Lee? Have you got a nickname?
Well, all my mates used to call me Brody, but when I first started on relief, mine was laptop because it was a small PC. But yeah, it was. It didn't stick for long.
It was brilliant.
Yeah,
They're always good.
Came along.
Yeah.
I did have an Irish friend at school who was called Connor Carney, and obviously his nickname became Chili for Chili con Carne, and that's the best nickname. And I've seen it in books since. It's a brilliant nickname. But yeah, if Chili's listening, which I doubt he is, hello. So, I mean, just in terms of some of the things that Lee and I have been speaking about on The Rest is Policing, a lot of it focuses on, whether or not, well, for example, last week we focused on police officers leaving and whether or not that is down to police pay or if there are other factors. And we had a really huge response to that, which we'll go into. I mean, what do you think about current retention rates, Steve? And what's your view? You could talk about it quite broadly in terms of policing in particular, in general. Where are we in policing? Are we in a healthy place? What are your concerns?
I think we're in crisis at the moment. I was actually invited to 10 Downing Street to speak to one of the police advisors. Their main concern was, how do we improve recruitment? And I said to him, so, well, you improve recruitment by improving retention of your experienced officers. Because when I joined back in 1983, I joined a relief. There was about 20, 25 people on this relief. And you had sort of service from, your probationers all the way up to people with 25, 27 years servicing. So that was the experience you could draw upon as a young PC, and that they help you to sort of build your sort of foundation as a police officer. Now, when I'm talking to colleagues coming into policing now, they're being sort of mentored by people who not even at probation themselves. So how are they able to sort of give that experience down to sort of the new recruits? So, and if you're a new recruit as well, and you're looking around and you're just surrounded by junior police officers, then that doesn't really give you any confidence that this is a good working environment for people. And the demise, I've probably opened up another can of worms, but the demise of the police canteen. And I know there's been all this sort of stuff about, canteen culture and all this lot, but that was your well-being room. That was where you sort of debriefed, you decompressed after sort of, God only knows what you've dealt with during the day. There's horrific sort of incidents, from fatal road traffic accidents to murders to sudden deaths. You sat in that room and you were able to just vent and talk to other people and get the reassurance that what you experience is perfectly natural. The stuff I teach now with the trauma risk management, the reactions you're having now are perfectly normal for being exposed to what is an abnormal situation. It's just you're dealing with it. You're going to be okay. You're going to get through that. There's no one there anymore to do that to the young people. So they're absorbing all this trauma. And it's got to go somewhere, and it manifests itself in people having sort of poor mental health in the police now. It's well documented. I mean, if you look at absence, long-term absence, 50% of that down to sort of like mental injuries as a result of the work that people are doing, and it's just because we're not picking up, we're not protecting people anymore.
In terms of the canteen culture, I mean, it's really relevant because when I started on shift, albeit 19 years ago, on one of our shifts, we used to have a weekend where we were the overlap shift. So you'd come back in at about 9 o'clock. And when nights took over, and you'd have a couple of hours where you were in the canteen, we cooked for each other, we brought meals in kind of thing, and we sat and we decompressed. Now, there was this negative image of the canteen culture, which was used to sort of break policing culture down as though policing culture was a bad thing. I'll be honest, I never saw any of the negativity of the canteen culture because we always saw the canteen moment, as you put, that decompression exercise, that decompression technique. But more importantly, it allowed you to gauge where your shift was at, who your shift was, but the kind of people that you're interacting with. Because if someone did make a right comment or someone did say something that was beyond what was acceptable, they would get pulled up on it. Yeah, and that was my experience when this focus was on smashing the canteen culture. From my perspective, all that's done is driven what may have been negative canteen cultures in small sections, isolated pockets across the country, across the force, etc. All it did was drive that off the grid, maybe onto social networking, WhatsApp, which is what we'll probably touch on that later on. But there is something to be said for that healthy culture of coming together. Because what we've got now, essentially, are lone wolves. We've got people that are working 8-9 hours a day out in the field on their own with no other contact, and they push to this extreme. The advent of mobile phones, laptops, you're encouraged to eat in the community. You're encouraged to stay out of the police station. So where are you actually building your solid support networks, and where are you able to offload properly? There is a real concern there. In smashing one thing, we've actually created a problem around mental health, the ability of officers to talk and decompress and to share experience.
It's really interesting because I remember this really well. When I go back 11 years, and I say this to Lee nearly every week, I was editing papers in London, and the story every week was I was editing Barnet Times, Harrow Times, Edgware Times, Hendon Times, Tottenham Independent, Enfield Independent, Boreham Wood Times, and every week there was a station in our patch closing every single week. So if you go back to 2011, we just had the London riots, we'd had the Mark Duggan incident, and then the riots in Haringey, and then broadened to other areas. And I remember we were talking to it might have been Victor Louisa, who was Chief Superintendent at Tottenham Police at the time, Haringey Police, about the number of stations that were being closed just generally. One, it was really sad because there were some really nice historical buildings that were being closed down as police stations. But we were saying to a lot of police, and this is in London in particular, and in other metropolitan areas, where are you going to go? There's just, where do you go? So what actually happened in that time? I mean, if you were both serving, what did you do? What was the change like? Did you have to go to a sort of main HQ all the time if you wanted to go in, or was there just nowhere to go? You're just staying out?
I mean, just on your network, Martin. So I think Enfield it was like an industrial unit. So you went up to, and we used to have a fantastic police station at Enfield. So they had the response teams would parade out of an industrial unit. So you would go onto an industrial estate, and that's where all the police vehicles were. So there's no access for members of the public to go in there. So no place to save. But I remember when I first started, my old police station, which is now a nice posh block of flats in Battersea, was the hub of the community. The people you had coming into the station, just phenomenal. And, they've found it a safe space to go to as well. And that's no longer available to people. Where do the members of the public go to now to feel safe?
Yeah, well, it's where this perspective, it's where the cops go as well to decompress. Because like I said, we had on division, we had the two central HQs, Ashton and Hyde, and then we had outer stations at Droylsden, Arlenshaw, up in Mottram. So wherever you were local, but you could pop in and have a brew. You could do something. That's all gone now. So you're having to go back into the central space, or you stay out. And cops don't always want to stay out. I mean, there was only something that I saw in the press the other day about there was a police officer parked on double yellow lines while they nipped in to get a coffee. So it's like, well, what else are you supposed to do? You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, to some degree. But you don't always want to be out in the public. Just as if you're in your own job, you don't always want to be in the office. The public arena being our office. You need that space where you can just retreat a little bit, have 10 minutes to yourself, refocus. It touches on the mental health first aid training that we've both done, doesn't it, Lobby? You've got to have that self-awareness, that ability to step back and to process and say, right, I'm just going to take 10 minutes to myself, and then we're back fully charged and ready for the day.
Yeah. And the problem now is those officers are taking all that stuff home with them.
Correct.
and the partners are picking up the pieces. So we're now offering a service where we look after children from as young as 4 years old, to absorbing the trauma. I mean, is it angry mum or dad who's coming through the door? I remember speaking to one colleague in South Yorkshire Police, and he said, he was heartbroken when his daughter said to him, says, when we hear the key going in the door, we all run upstairs and pretend to be asleep because we don't know if it's angry dad coming in. And that completely destroyed him. He didn't realise that's what he was doing. And that story repeated all over the place. I mean, I was chatting to one Met officer who said, it was his wife who pulled him up. His kid had done something very trivial, dropped something on the floor, spilt some milk, and he was just led into this kid. And his wife was just stood there looking at him, and he looks to what? And she explained what he'd just done. And he didn't realise what he did. Speaking to his father,
completely relate. Yeah, can completely relate. When I was at the cusp of burnout and the apex of burnout and then PTSD, I was constantly agitated, and angry, and one of the biggest. It's a regret, but one of the most difficult challenges I had when I was doing the AMDR is trying to put down that baggage and that guilt of what I'd put my family through, unknowingly. But it's like you say, they were aware of what state I was going to come home in, how I was going to treat them, or what I was going to say. The simplest thing of just, can I have 5 minutes of your time? And because I was so consumed with myself, I had no awareness of their needs, and I was snapping. It was a horrible thing.
There's no handbook comes with it. If you're married to a cop or seeing a cop, this is how you look after them. They don't get any of that. There's loads of stuff that's that the police get about sort of, well, I say loads of stuff, but you get the tick box stuff around mental health awareness and all that sort of stuff. But we're the world's worst at accepting that we're stressed and we can't cope with the job because coming back to what you were saying earlier about people leaving for pay condition. They're not leaving for pay condition. They're leaving because of work conditions.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the last true, a bit like nursing, it's one of the last true vocations in life. We do it because we've got this innate sort of, desire to help people. If you look at sort of cops and ex-cops, they've still got that desire, they want to help people. And this is what I found with Trojan Wellbeing. When I get former cops coming on board, they just want to help colleagues, they just want to help people, and it's still there. So it's one of the sort of like strong character traits, and it's also one of the main reasons why people struggle so much when they're facing misconduct investigation, because their integrity and the sort of like the policing sort of skills are being questioned, and that gets right under the skin. And especially if it's another colleague who's done that complaint, put it in that. And for me, because I went through gross misconduct when I was with a Met, and one of my sort of driving reasons for sort of like pushing ahead with Trojan Wellbeing was it was two colleagues who made complaints about me. They're still not been identified, but it's still sort of really sort of gets me angry. Even though I've spoken to counsellors, therapists, we've got so many on board, and they tell you all the tricks and what, but it still gets me sort of like angry feeling about people doing that to you.
I suppose we have to be a bit guarded in that though as well, don't we? Because we should recognise and acknowledge that there are failings within our service, and there are people that are treated badly, and there are people that get it wrong, either honestly or on purpose. And we should champion to some degree our colleagues in coming forward and raising those issues. Would you say there's a right way and a wrong way in doing it, Lobby?
The right way for me is that if you had good intentions, but you made a mistake, and I've made mistakes throughout my policing career, and people are pointed, but they were done for the best intention at the time. But if you're deliberately doing something with bad intentions, that's the wrong way, and that's what needs to be challenged. And going back to what the relief was like, if someone did step over that line, the senior PCs would square it away. If it was serious, it got to the sergeant. And if the sergeant's having to deal with something on the team, it's serious. And if the inspector hears about it, then there's only one way for that officer to go, and that sort of like a complaint was being put in. But if you can't deal with it, I mean, obviously there's serious offences, and we go back to the two main sort of culprits in the Met that really catapulted the sort of misconduct thing. When you've got people like that, then that's beyond all.
Quiet word is never going to do, is it? No.
And every cop worth his salt or her salt would put their hands that they would never tolerate a bent police officer or someone as evil as that, and they would do the right thing. And having seen a number of police officers who've been involved in supplying information to organised crime gangs. I mean, I was involved with especially firearms command, so we worked with the DPS surveillance or the professional standard surveillance, and they were following some really evil people that wore the uniform. And there was nothing more satisfying than to take someone down like that, because I mean, if you remember, sort of like someone like Ken Fordham, for example, the surveillance officer who was murdered by Kenneth Noy, that was through information put through by another police officer.
Yeah.
And that's the level we're talking about. That's the evil that we're talking about. And I don't know whether you've ever spoken to sort of Dave McElvey from my local Bobby. He does TMI as well. He does a private investigation, but
yeah.
I mean, he deals with a lot of corruption within the police. And when you start to talk about the people who are involved in that, they're real nasty people. And if there are people protecting that, then they deserve to be dragged in with that person as well, because you shouldn't be protecting evil people like that. But what we're getting now is, if someone makes a comment, then they're being sort of dragged over the coals. There's no room for someone making a mistake anymore.
Yeah. Do you think? So I don't know whether you wanted to chip in here, Martin, because I feel like we can go off thinking. But
I was just going to say, because we've got one of the things we wanted to talk about was misconduct and almost inconsistent outcomes with certain things. And I always remember, again, from my Oracle days, is how different forces dealt with different problems. So we had one case in the north somewhere, I think it was in the northeast, where a police officer had been found. It had been proven that they'd tampered with evidence. They'd done something, and it was pretty bad. And everyone assumed they were going to lose their job, and they got a final written warning. And then in London, you had an officer who'd used his warrant card to get the train and sat in first class because he was tired and got dismissed. And then you also had an officer who helped. It was a big story at the time. I can't remember what it might have been at the start of COVID, actually. It was a big story. Helped a homeless person out of a Tesco, went back in, Tesco's, bought them some biscuits, gave them the biscuits, and again was dismissed. So you've got these bizarre, inconsistent outcomes where one force is dismissing an officer for sitting in first class with a warrant, worked all day. They said there was nowhere to go. I just needed to sit down for a second. And in other areas, you've got officers probably doing something you could consider to be, criminally illegal, and almost getting away with it. And obviously, if they're convicted, they probably would lose their job. But up until that point, how do you deal with that in terms of inconsistent outcomes? And what kind of impact does that have on officers? I mean, it must have a huge impact. So if you find you're losing your job for one thing and others are, the bad guys, if you like, that we talk about, are being kept on.
It's horrendous. I mean, it's like it's another sort of stab in the back for these officers who are going through. I mean, some of these misconduct investigations are going on for years, and when you look at what they're being investigated, I mean, we're dealing with one colleague who's being disciplined because of failing to keep their expenses up. But it was something that had been highlighted that these people are just so busy, they haven't got time to sort of reconcile expenses and receipts and all that. I mean, you're asking them to be accountants as well as to be like undercover officers working on quite sort of high profile operations. And this is sort of like from 2 years ago. And she's been investigated for that. And you're thinking, but what really sort of like causes problems is that they've recognised the problem, so they've changed the policy now. But she's still been investigated because of what they changed the
Yeah.
policy for, and you just thinking, where's the common sense in all this? You know, why is a normal not just stepping forward and saying, hold on a minute, you know, we're losing some very, very good officers. I mean, they're being put on the barred list for 5 years. They can't get jobs with companies because they're on the barred list. All they see is that, oh, this person's been dismissed from the police for integrity issues. And you think, okay, well, we're not going to employ someone who's dishonest. But when you look at it, it's a receipt that they've not put in, or you know, they made a claim for something and they got the claim wrong for £4.90 or something. And you're thinking, seriously?
Yeah.
And this is a thing that is just so frustrating. I'm the eternal optimist that I think one day someone's just going to say, right, stop. This has got to stop, because we've got no practitioners left on the street. We've got loads of people sat behind desks with degrees and saying, oh, I've done all these policing degrees and I can tell you where the crimes are occurring, but there's no one on the streets to deal with it. You know, we've got loads of cameras identifying people, but we haven't got anyone to go out and arrest people because everyone's in the station.
Yeah. Coming back to the discrepancy in outcomes. It was interesting. I was listening to the Law and Order podcast area with Danny Shaw, and he was featuring on that, and he raised around, you know, the amount of inefficiency that's built into the system within policing anyway, within the procurement, back office functions and stuff. But the 43 force model and how that in itself is wasteful, and it got me thinking in terms of the disparity of outcomes across forces in terms of misconduct and things. Would a streamlining of the model lead to better or more consistent outcomes, and would that generate more faith, or is it a step to generate more faith in the misconduct system? Because at the minute, officers don't generally have a faith in the misconduct system, and I know the 2020 regs that were brought in for a learning imperative, so you could receive reflective practice, and there was an emphasis on owning your mistake early, so that you could get not so that you could get, but owning the mistake early and showing honesty, integrity, and a truthfulness and accountability. Then, as a court sentence, as I guess would show, you're probably likely to get a lesser sanction. And it was more geared towards learning outcomes, whereas now we seem to be going back to the pre-2020 regs, where any sort of breach or finding of misconduct is geared towards dismissal or the presumption of dismissal, or so when you've got that. When you've got the flip of regs and you've got such inconsistency across 43 chief officers who will have 43 different opinions on what harm looks like, or what misconduct or gross misconduct amounts to, how do we get around that to bring faith back into the misconduct system?
I think it's having very experienced detectives involved in the professional standards department. And what we're finding now are incompetent investigators involved who are just not even doing the basics right in regards to investigations and making basic mistakes. I mean, they're actually committing more breaching more police regs by doing the investigation than they are for the person investigating, which doesn't make any sense. You know, and this is, I think, if you have an efficient and experienced professional standards unit, you'd be able to sort of get rid of a lot of these complaints quite quickly, because you know, you can look at what's coming across your desk, and this used to be the old days. The inspector in the station, someone will make a complaint at the station, and you go, right, I'm sorry, but that's not going anywhere. That is my officer doing what he should be doing. And you know, I'll refer to someone like, you know, PC Castle down in Dorset.
Yeah.
You know, he dealt with that person robustly. Yeah, he said a few choice words, but I used to spend some of the sessions on the firearms training. We'd spend people teaching them verbal stunning. And he admits, yeah, he probably lost a bit of control, but he still dealt with that person and restrained that person without injuring that person. So it's subjective. I don't think he's lost control. He's dealt with that person. He's used robust language, and he's not been supported by other colleagues who were present. If those people had got involved, this wouldn't have got anyone near
That comes to empowered decision making, though, doesn't it? And that comes to having faith in the system again. It's having that confidence in that, one, the regulations are there for a purpose, but me as a supervisor, or me as a someone with 19 years experience, there's that level of delegation that says that you are capable and you are trusted to deal with these matters at a local level. But what I'm thinking is, beyond that, beyond staffing PSDs with skilled detectives, which, you know, that could be 10, 20 years away, given the current deficiencies and inefficiencies built in as we've got now as a result of various healthy churn products. But in terms of the outcomes, you've got experienced chief officers here. You've got experienced chief constables, deputy chief constables, or senior leaders that are now being charged with making decisions on whether to dismiss officers or not. How do you get consistency there? Is what I'm looking at. How do we build that fairness back into that situation? Because, take for instance, Mark Rowley's assessment of what is reputational damage to the force, and Stephen Watson's assessment as to what reputational damage to the force will be entirely different, because they both come from very different policing backgrounds and have very different policing exposure. Steve Watson, for instance, very, very proactive, or he was heavily involved in TAU and specialist operations at his time at Lancashire, so used to that kind of robust policing. Not quite sure what Mark Rowley's overall background are, but you're coming at it from two different opinions. How can that be fair if there's a postcode lottery of outcomes across the country?
Well, the common denominator, though, is still the Home Office. So the Home Office dictate what they expect from the police force. So what is a message that's coming down from the Home Office? You know, and you're right. You know, Steve Watson will interpret it different to what Mark Rowley will do, but it's still the same message. And we had this problem time and time again with various commanders within the firearms unit and on borough as well. Is that, you know, they would be saying all the right things, but the problem is middle management were putting their own twist on it. So when that message actually got down to the people out on the street, it was a completely different message to what the commander had been saying. And this is where we're going wrong. So are we now in that situation where senior officers who have got their eye on promotion are trying to appease those up there, as opposed to not looking after the people out in the streets? And with the experience we've certainly got within Trojan Wellbeing, is, I think, sadly, that's the case, is that they're looking in the wrong direction. They're more about appeasing the people above than looking after what is actually going out on the streets and listening. There's a massive disconnect between senior officers and those on the streets now, and this is where we've got this breakdown in trust with senior management. You know, and if you do follow sort of, you know, certainly the mental health side of things, when you've got a breakdown in that moral sort of morale in your senior management, I mean, the last resort, or the last sort of bastion, is when you start to sort of lose trust in the people you work alongside. And I think that this is what we're starting to see now, where people don't trust other colleagues, and that is crisis point.
On that point, is it so? When you look at I guess what you really need at that point then is a really strong staff association to come in and support people. And obviously, we all know there are reps up and down the country for the Police Federation who are fantastic. They're absolutely brilliant in what they do. Just out of interest, what kind of credibility does the Police Federation have with forces now at the senior level when dealing with these kind of cases, or supporting officers, when you see some of the suspensions now that are coming out of the Police Federation? Is that sort of damaging to the Federation's credibility when supporting officers through you know, any similar hearings or problems?
We're quite fortunate in Trojan Wellbeing, where the proactive Fed reps have actually reached out to us because they can see the support we can provide. The unfortunate thing is, a lot of the colleagues we're looking after, I mean, we're actually chatting to one colleague from Bedfordshire Police who said his Fed rep turned up in the same vehicle as the guy from the Professional Standards Department. So you think
Not a good look.
no.
Blimey.
So you think where's the independence in relation to that? And we've got another colleague, and this was something that I actually mentioned to Steve Hartson when he was sat in the chair, is that have you actually considered using retired police officers as Fed reps? I said, because they're not going to be worried about their tenure. They're not going to be worried about whether you're going to get posted to Moss Side or Brixton or anything like that, because they've done all that, and you can't really touch them. So they've really got that civil police staff protection, even though when you speak to union reps, they're not really all that protected at the moment. But I said, use retired police officers, because you've got the experience. You've got people who've been there, done that, and they can see whether people have, if you've made a mistake, then you're going to get good solid advice from this colleague. He's going to say, right, you've made a mistake, put your hands up, and we can get this sorted out. But if it's a case of you've done everything by the book, let's challenge this. We're not just going to roll over. Let's challenge this, because I wanted Fed reps. If I was in the right, I wanted Fed reps who were banging the table, and the senior officer was saying, get out of my office type stuff. I didn't want Fed reps who were appeasing the senior officer because they were frightened that senior officer was going to turn around and say, "Oh, you've been on the firearms unit a long time now, Fed rep. Is it time you look to sort of go to another place?" And that sort of like leaning on.
It's the same with anything, isn't it? People seek out people who, one, have a good reputation because they've represented previous officers, and two, they'll know that they'll actually work on their behalf. I mean, I've not been doing Feddy stuff now since but I still get approached on a daily basis around regulations. Can they do this? And I'm still assisting people where we can, because as you say, kind of like policing, it's inbuilt in you. There are some people that they see the injustices within policing quite early on, and they say, well, hang on, who's looking after the people that are looking after the public? And you get a passion for it, and it's really satisfying sometimes when you get a good case home, or when you make a difference to your colleague's situation, or you win that ET for disability discrimination, and it's a really, really good feeling within the force. So you've actually touched on something, which is a question I often get asked in terms of when we talk about how do you go about setting up a new organisation, etc. One of the big things is, well, where are you going to get your reps from? And it's like I've always said, good reps will go to places that treat them well as well. Yeah. Because what we found, certainly when I was chair of the GMPF, one of the complaints that we got regularly from the council is that council were isolated, or the council were over subscribed in terms of what they can offer, and they didn't feel that they got the support from the central team. And that, I'm sure, is consistent with the reps that assist on Trojan Wellbeing.
Yeah, and a lot of them are coming to us because they can see how we're supporting colleagues, and they're being given the freedom to do what they want to do. They want to support that person and give them that advice without having the pressure from senior management teams, or even head office at Leverett. Unfortunately, it's quite sad to sort of see the lack of support coming down from head offices at the moment, and there's going to have to be a lot of work done to rebuild the trust with the 128,000 paying members that the Fed have got.
We touched on this a bit earlier in terms of when we were talking about sort of bad apples, and the Sarah Everard case as one of the worst in recent history. I just wanted to touch on police vetting as well, and to talk about, first of all, what your thoughts are on vetting, and then some of the things that I maybe hear from other members of the media who talk about police vetting and the way they see it, and to see if there is actually an issue with it, or if it's something that needs tweaking, or if it's something that needs a complete overhaul. So just to both of you, really, in terms of police vetting, what do you see currently as the biggest issues within police vetting? Because it's something that's getting a fair amount of exposure.
But from our point of view and our experience, it's being used as a third bite of the cherry. And sadly, it's being abused. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is a need for vetting within the police. And we've got different levels of vetting. You come into the police, you get basic police vetting to make sure that you've got no sort of skeletons in the closet. You haven't got a criminal record, even though people are still getting into the job with criminal records. So there's those basic checks. I mean, when I joined, it was I think a sergeant and inspector came round to the home address, check up to make sure I lived there and that my parents, were of good character. But now it just seems to be it's being used as a massive big stick and a backdoor way of getting rid of officers. And what's happened recently, which obviously there's been the sort of challenge in the High Court where the opus juror in the Met has been found to be unlawful, with the way that they're using it to sort of dismiss officers. We're having colleagues who are going through a gross misconduct investigation. And I don't say that flippantly. I mean, these investigations have gone on for 2-3 years. So they've gone through that nightmare. They've been found no case to answer. They then get reinstated. They then lose their vetting because they've been involved in a gross misconduct investigation, even though that evidence has been found to be either false or doesn't prove the facts. They're still using the same evidence to revoke someone's vetting, and then they're being dismissed because they can't carry out the role of a police officer. I mean, how, in the eyes of anyone, any competent sort of person, I mean, how does that look to the member of the public when you
It's ludicrous.
gone through that investigation and then thrown out because they failed the vetting? You can have two ways. One is going to be, well, there's no smoke without fire. So
yes,
he was obviously a wrong-un because they finally sort of got rid of him, even though they couldn't find anything when he went through the gross misconduct. Or there's going to be a case of why are we getting rid of all these people? What is going on in relation to this?
And this is something that I know we've spoken about as well, Lobby, in terms of the different pressures that police chiefs are under as well. Because at the minute, the political directive is you need to clean up your forces, you need to sort this out, you need to regain public trust. But there's a way in doing that where you don't then use good police officers that have made honest mistakes as sacrificial lambs in order to wave a flag and saying, look what we're doing over here, how brilliant are we? And I think that's the problem in terms of where we've gone with the vetting at the minute. We've gone from one pendulum swing where austerity led to huge reductions in the amount of staff that could vet, and therefore we fell behind in our capabilities and what we're able to keep up with, to the absolute opposite side of the pendulum now, where everything is just right. We'll use this as a tool to get rid. We won't have any proper strict or common sense procedures or practices in place. We'll arbitrarily use it to dismiss officers that we think pose a risk to our service, and that in itself can't be defined properly. As you say, what is a risk to your service? Is a wry tweet on social media that is critical of the Metropolitan's police policy on whistleblowing a risk to the service? Or is it, as you say, the fact that you've gone through a gross misconduct investigation, found no case to answer, but still potentially you might be a wrong un, so we'll get rid of you? It's just it's ludicrous.
On the sort of the side, so from the member of the public point of view, one of the things I talk to, or one of the things that's mentioned to me by journalists a lot of the time, and it might be a bit of a misunderstanding in terms of how the vetting process has worked over the years and what's happened. But touching on your point, Lee, in terms of austerity, you go back to Cameron and May and the austerity and the number of police officers that were lost. And then there was, I remember Theresa May at the Police Federation conference before I joined the Federation saying that, there's no link between a fall in police officers and the increase in violent crime. And everyone thinking, is this a joke? There clearly is. And then the years of denial, and then a new administration within the government going, pressing the oh shit button. I think we have got this wrong. We need to recruit more officers. And then I was at the Police Federation. There's this huge push, this surge to recruit officers, tens of thousands, to the point now that many people, I suppose more journalists that I speak to in sort of policing circles, sort of crime journalists, believe that perhaps the floodgates opened and almost anybody was allowed in to anybody that applied for a job as a police officer was allowed in, and now they're almost weeding out the bad apples, if you like, and maybe there are too many of those. Is there any truth in that? And did that happen in any way, or is it just that the system's letting police officers down? I'll let you deal with your cat before you answer it, Lee.
It's all right. I knew it was going to happen at one point.
But is there any truth in that? Did have people been recruited as police officers that shouldn't be in that role? And when you look at there was a point as well, wasn't there, where police forces were facing financial penalties if they couldn't recruit a certain number. So clearly, the onus is going to be on numbers, then, isn't it, and not the best people for the job. So has that played a part, or where are we with that?
I mean, we speak to colleagues on a daily basis where they talk about people who haven't even been vetted, who've come into the police force, and they're getting a message saying this person actually wanted on warrant, and arresting people at the police station because they're actually wanted. Going back to basic sort of police checks. No one's carrying that out because, as you said, this drive, this 10,000 police officers that we're going to recruit to put back onto the streets. I spoke to someone who's involved in recruitment in the Met, and 2024, I think they had a net gain of 84 police officers during that period of time. The Met were recruiting 300-400 people a month to join the Met, so they've not kept up with the pace of people leaving the police service.
Yeah. I mean, going back to your floodgates opening, Martin, I'll give you two examples that I'm aware of that were reported in the Manchester Evening News as to just what the pressure was probably like in order to get these bums on the seat so that forces didn't suffer this. And it wasn't so much a financial penalty. What happened is they'd been given the money up front, and what government said is if you don't put these bums on seats, we'll simply remove a proportion of that funding because you didn't do it. So it was a reverse incentive. But I mean, one officer was obviously you can't attain, you can't be a statistician to the constable until you're 18 years old. You can put in your application earlier, but you can't actually be sworn in as a constable until 18 years old. Unfortunately, nobody picked up on that and sworn this officer in at 17 and a half.
Oh, wow.
So exactly, I mean, and that was reported in the Manchester Evening News. And there's other instances where one officer was recruited, went through the process, I don't want to be disparaging, for want of a better word, considerably lacking in what was required of a police officer, and was dismissed for gross incompetence under the probationary standards. 6 months later, he sat back in Sedgley Park wearing a uniform. And this was the emphasis until it was picked up. Hang on a minute, you can't be here. This, and it was flagged up. So there was a massive pressure, and I'm sure there is this tendency, and I think it's a very, very easy tendency to try and shift blame, so to speak, to say, well, we're under a huge amount of pressure. We had to recruit these officers. We had to get numbers up, and we'll work through it, and we'll get things right. Well, actually, that was the wrong approach to take. And as police chiefs, were paid a good portion of money to deal with these situations, you should have asked to put the pause button on it, because there were people within inside the service, myself being one, that were saying we are going too fast on this. We need to pause and think of the future ramifications. But just touching on your young versus old point, I know you didn't quite word it like that, as to whether we have an influx of people that just aren't equipped to be police officers, etc. I work at the minute with some incredibly passionate and determined police officers who are very young in service, who have literally been thrown in at the lion's end of policing in terms of, as you've touched on, Nobby, the lack of shift experience, the lack of, to some degree, managerial experience and sergeanting and leadership, etc., that do an incredibly difficult job under incredibly difficult pressures very well. And it's disparaging for them when they hear, to some degree, people who are in the media and people within our own organisation saying, well, actually, this is to some degree, policing's in the state it is because of you or your inexperience, or because you might not have the skills to be police officers. And I think we just need to have a counter on that to some degree. Not only that, it'd be interesting to see, actually, what the proportion is of those people within the 20,000 uplift that have been removed because of failed vetting or misconduct, versus the proportion of people that are later down the service, and I don't think it'd bear out in statistics that this is the sole problem of the uplift program.
I'm a prime example of joining at a very young age. I was actually a police cadet. So in the old Metropolitan Police, we are police cadets. So I joined the police when I was 17. I went through the police cadet system, and as you say, I was attested. I think it was 18 and a half before you can be attested.
It was back then. They changed it, didn't they?
Oh, okay. So 18 and a half, I was attested as a police officer, and I joined Hendon, the police training college. So I was very young, but obviously a wealth of sort of life experience during that period of time with the other stuff I've been doing. So, but I had the privilege of being mentored by some extremely experienced police officers, and that's why I'm so passionate about. If you want to improve recruitment, you've got to improve retention of your good police officers, because they are the backbone of the police. They're the ones that helped me get through my policing, and they're going to help people get other new recruits coming in, and that's where the focus needs to be on. But unfortunately, those experienced police officers, and understandably so, are finding out that there is no support from anymore. They're being thrown under the bus by senior management, and they can't risk it because they've got their own families. They don't want to be looking at sort of spending time in prison because they put an offensive joke on a WhatsApp group 7 years ago. That stuff is now found because another member of the group has been arrested for an offence, and they've gone through the phone and found these jokes and stuff on the phone. There's no victims. I mean, one colleague spent 3 months in prison because he was a member of the Wayne Couzens WhatsApp group. There was no victim to that. It was just that he was a member of the group that Wayne Couzens was on, and he was convicted of 3 months inside because there was some offensive jokes on there. Now, King's College down in London have done studies on dark humour in the military, in the emergency services, and some of the conversations I've been privy to, they would turn you towards, but it's actually when you look at the context of those conversations and what it followed, some horrific events. That's how people dealt with it. But and that's the difference. And you touched on it, Lee. That we could do that in the canteen. It was dealt with. People would sort of be flagged up that, perhaps they're not in a good place because of what they just said. But because it has now been moved onto a WhatsApp group, and you can't remove that comment, it's
not just the comments, though, is it? I mean, we're straying into the realms of, if you share a Ricky Gervais joke, for instance, something that's wisely out there. If you have a YouTube snippet or I'm showing my age now. It's TikTok now, isn't it, Martin? All these younger if you send that TikTok message internally, and then someone takes a grievance to it in professional standards, having reviewed all this, as why wasn't that challenged? Because it was potentially homophobic, potentially transgender. We're really straying into a dark place in terms of what we're actually policing.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you were saying about right and wrong, and we were all aware of when someone made a comment, you knew whether it was said in jest and whether there was any actually meaning behind it, or whether that person deliberately wanted to cause harm by that comment, and that's when you say, "Hold on, no, I'm not having that." There is a line. You've overstepped the line.
Yeah, and like you say, most of us are trained professionals around this. Most of the members of the public appreciate that unique concept of the officer constable, in that we shouldn't have this pressure from above, and we are able to show discretion based on our professional judgment, the interaction at the time, the context around that. It's why most members of the public relate so closely to the Bobby on the beat, us, because we're able to give that discretionary outcome. We're able to judge what might have been an infraction on their part and say, well, I'm not going to come down and arrest you. I'm not going to fine you. I'm just going to tell you off. Don't say that again, mate. That's highly inappropriate. Go away, go home, sleep it off, do it. And that's what we do on the streets with people with public order. But we can't police internally.
It's interesting, actually, because I think it's a really good point, because I remember in the 90s, my very early days in journalism, I should say the late 90s, we used to spend a lot of time in the pub on a Friday when we were going to press with police officers, and we'd be chatting and dark humour. We used and because as journalists in those days, we were exposed to quite a lot of hard stuff as well. I remember a really good. It was a DC who used to like talking to me about how important dark humour was and using it in the right way, and that's the key, because what I remember is there always being jokes where you go, yeah, brilliant, and they're all proper, and then eventually, and particularly in my, recently, which incidents I've been involved in that Lee knows about, where things were said in a working environment that then cross the line, and that's where somebody has to grab somebody and just go, no, that's not right, because now you're talking about somebody rather than an incident, or you're being, or you're offending people around you. But I guess you also lose that within policing as well, because you rely on that canteen culture for to be able to sometimes
correct, it's check and balance.
It's like a barometer, isn't it? And maybe sometimes some people, you know what can happen in the heat of a moment. You crack a joke, you've only got 1 second to crack a joke, as Ricky Gervais said, and things can go wrong. So it's really interesting the way perhaps policing, the cultures meant that maybe people are finding themselves in more trouble than they might have been sort of 20 years ago.
Well, that's what I mean. It's driven it away from actually me being able to challenge you, and it's driven it onto a WhatsApp group where you might go, that's a bit bad, but you're not going to challenge on the WhatsApp group, or you might not feel confident to challenge it. And then somebody reads it 6 months down the line without the context behind it, without the thingy behind it, and then says, well, everyone in that group is now responsible because you failed to challenge that inappropriate conduct. But it's easier to challenge inappropriate conduct sometimes. I mean, Graham Golden, who we're looking to have on as a guest soon, hopefully, he talks about bystander intervention and how we should be upstanders. And it's easier if you can have that conversation immediately with all the context, and you can just go, no, mate, that's a bit too much, as opposed to reading something on a WhatsApp group, putting it down, and then forgetting about it. If we're not in the spaces to be upstanders, as Graham would say, and we're not in the spaces where we can have those honest conversations with our colleagues, are we failing them?
The other aspect, and this is something I'm keen to sort of get across, certainly to our welfare officers, is why has that colleague made that comment? What's going on with them? What's in their stress container for them to make that comment, which is out of character, and it's in complete bad taste. Even for coppers, it's bad taste. So for me, I always, and this was a turning point for me, I always used to think, why is that person acting like that? What's happened to that person for them to be in this situation? And then you ask them, say, is everything all right, mate? Because that's not like you, and you're out of character. And then you normally get down to, they're either going through a marriage breakup, something's going on at home, or they're still not dealt with an incident, a traumatic incident, and it's still unresolved. And this is what we need to start thinking of: why are people doing these things? When you hear about some of the things that police officers are doing, think that's so stupid. Why would they want to jeopardise their career? We hear about sort of police inspectors shoplifting and things like that. You're thinking, why is that person who's on 60, 70 grand a year gone and done shoplifting? What has happened to that person for them to find themselves in that situation? This is the conversation we need to be having. Why are these police officers breaking and doing silly things? Because there are some silly things going on that need to be addressed. But let's have the early intervention stuff and stop them find themselves in this situation. I keep saying, let's go further up the river and find out why people are throwing themselves.
Why people are falling in. Yeah.
It's also interesting because I think there's a wider societal problem as well, and particularly in organisations now. And I'm not going to talk about ones that I've been involved in, but I've seen it where things have been reported about people and that information's stored rather than dealt with. So if it was dealt with, you could say to that person, "Well, I'm going to give you some advice. You did this or said this, and we can't. That's inappropriate. We're going to deal with it now." But what I think I've seen more and more, particularly in the corporate world, but it seems to be almost everywhere, is a storing of information until there's one incident that almost the straw that breaks the camel's back, and then they throw everything at it, and nobody ever asks why these incidents 4 years old, 3 years old. Why didn't you deal with them then? it's just all thrown at that person. And then before you know it, people are taken on this investigation, colleagues as well, because they've got to give evidence and put in a really awkward situation. And that just seems to be almost a professional standard these days, where people are just allowing it to continue and then deal with it when the time's right for the organisation, rather than dealing with it suitably as a person.
And I think that's interesting, Matt, because it does touch back on something we mentioned earlier about colleagues having the confidence to come forward and do that challenge where it's appropriate. And you mentioned it, Lobby, about someone making a complaint about you, etc. There has to be this space where people, one, trust each other that we're actually acting for the right reasons in addressing something that's challenged us. And two, that there's that psychological safe space to know that if you are going to raise a complaint or you are going to raise an issue in a manner which is fair, which is done from a position of trust and a position of caring, that you yourself are then going to be trusted and cared for doing so. Because too often in policing, what we see as well is people raising complaints, such as the ones that you've mentioned, Martin, them being targeted, them being ostracised, them being the problem and simply moved away, as opposed to actually dealing with something which would be quite manageable at the time to resolve, as opposed to storing it or then blaming or looking to apportion blame everywhere. I think we're really, really good in touching back on what you were saying a minute ago, Lobby. We're really, really good in policing at breaking people, but not very good at recognising and understanding how we broke them and what we need to do to support them.
They don't want to accept liability that they've broken the officer. I mean, so we've got a dedicated ill-health retirement group. The vast majority of people going through that process are battling to have things like PTSD, complex PTSD linked to their policing role. Even to the point where one of the doctors involved doesn't even recognise PTSD. How can that person be on it? But it's all about protecting the organisation. As soon as they say, yes, we've broken this officer, then obviously they're opening themselves up to all sorts of claims and compensation. So instead they go down the route that they will not recognise it as an injury on duty, and you have to go through the rigmarole of getting psychiatrist reports, to back up the evidence that that your GP has been saying for the last God knows how many years. You're on the edge. There's you've got clear symptoms that you've got classic PTSD or complex PTSD, as is the case with most police officers. It's not just one traumatic event. It's numerous events.
Multiple.
You've just suppressed over the time because you've just wanted to make the job work, and you've not felt comfortable or safe to put your hand up and say, I'm actually struggling here, with my mental health to cope with what's going on, because that was it. You wanted to sort of like carry on working. You didn't want to let the team down, especially if you're on a specialist unit. My background was firearms, and for firearms officers to stick their hand up and say, I'm struggling with my mental health. That was it. That was them taking off ops.
With professional suicide.
Oh yeah, and whether they'd see a gun again is sort of debatable. They had to go through hoops and hurdles to get back onto ops again. So guess what? People didn't put their hands up until they finally went pop. And I highlighted this to one senior officer. I mean, my role was sort of teaching the firearms officers who are responsible for looking after premises in London ports. 1,500 officers. And they have a 3-month training cycle. So I started doing the stress awareness input. And it was basically the PTSD questionnaire, so a lifestyle questionnaire. I didn't tell them this because I didn't want them to sort of start thinking, I'm going to find out if I've got PTSD. I just said it's a lifestyle questionnaire. So I took them through this. Halfway through the training, so I'd done about 700 officers at this point. I'd identified 20 officers who needed immediate counselling because their scores were just off the charts and then needed help immediately. And then you could probably double that number of people coming up to me saying that question has really opened up my eyes to what's going on, and I think I need to do something about it. So we did quite a bit of work and fantastic support from the Police Firearms Officer Association who helped with sort of wellbeing and stuff, and Police Care stepped in as well. So we were helping these people, and I approached my boss, a chief inspector, and said, I am concerned about the stress levels within the firearms command. I've been doing the stress awareness input, and these are my findings. And he turned to me and said, "Stop doing the questionnaire." And I thought, I've got another 800 officers out there, and I've just told you that I am concerned about their levels of stress. These are people carrying loaded firearms on the streets of London, and it doesn't take much, to be involved in a altercation with someone. Someone just gets a red mist, loses the rag, and we've got a firearms incident. And I said this. I said, "Okay, so what do you want me to do?" He said, "Stop doing the questionnaire. It's not your remit as a firearms instructor to sort of do the stress awareness." I said, "Well, it is." Because I'm signing these people off saying that they're competent to carry firearms on the streets of London. So if I've got concerns, I've got the authority to take the firearms authority off them. So it's well within my remit. So that was really, I suppose, the beginning of my demise, really, with the Metropolitan Police, when I professionally embarrassed this chief inspector.
Which is such a wrong position to be in, because essentially, it's a good, well-balanced firearms officer is what the force and the public actually need. If your stress levels are so high that your tolerance to risk or stress is then diminished, then that's not good for anybody.
No, and we've all been into work. We've not slept well. Kids have kept you up. You've had a massive argument with the boss at home. You've gone into work, and you're not going to deal with the same situations you would deal with another day if you'd had good sleep and you're in a good frame of mind, because your stress container's already full. So it won't take much for that to go over the top. And this was what I pointed out to him. I said, we need to have better early intervention with this. We need a network of people that are properly trained to spot those stress signatures and have the confidence to have a conversation with someone and say, "Are you all right, mate? Because I've noticed this," or you're not looking after your kit as you normally do, or that type of stuff. That's the early intervention, which is so important.
Go on, Lee. I don't know.
I was just going to say, I don't know if the members of the public that are listening to this, I don't know whether they will think this is quite alien, that we haven't actually got any stress levers in the organisation, that an officer that's struggling can pull and just say, "I need 10 minutes or 5 minutes." Because I don't know anybody even on relief now that will come in. There are colleagues that I work next door to that are carrying 40 crimes that are coming in, expected to deal and investigate those 40 crimes, whilst also picking up any new crime and any prisoners that come through the door. And their stress levels are up here. And it would be almost, it's unheard of for one of them to turn around and just go, "I just need 10 minutes to sort my head out, sort this out." What happens anyway? What happens on the outskirts of that is you'll get people reported sick for longer periods of time, or you'll simply get presenteeism, where people are switched off and are numb and are just showing up when they're not invested. And nobody wants that in policing.
No, I think there's huge levels of naivety in the general public about the demands on policing. Because obviously I've got a lot of people who aren't. I know a lot of people who are police officers, a lot of people who aren't, and I've also worked within policing as a civilian for years. And a lot of people will never understand even when I covered the Monk case, which was the Dalian Atkinson case, and I was talking to people who are football fans, and their view was always, the police officers did that and this, and I was explaining to them, how they went to this event, and really it was a mental health case. In an ideal world, if there was adequate mental health provision, it would never have happened. But also the demands they were under, the day they'd faced, what then happened, and what were they suspected to do. The family thought he was going to kill the dad, so they called the officers out. They taser him, and he's got a whole other he has a reaction due to things in his body and whatever else. He was a very strong former Premier League footballer, and you try and explain it to people so they understand the kind of complexities around that case, and it's all very black and white with a lot of people, and they don't really understand the demands of even going back 5 years, where we used to talk a lot about police officers becoming ambulances and police officers having to be, almost being the first people on a medical case, or a medical emergency. So I do think there's huge naivety about it. And my view was always, even when I was at the Police Federation, I think my view's always been that policing has always been too obsessed with talking to police officers. and perhaps policing needs to try and talk to members of the public in the same way the NHS does, or the NHS has in recent years, to try and help them understand the issues. But I think too many people in policing, particularly within associations, whether it's the NPCC, the Supers, Police Fed, are too busy dealing with members rather than dealing with, trying to educate members of the public. That's always been my personal opinion.
That's a good observation.
It'd be interesting to see, because there's been definitely a change or a shift in the way that the body-worn video is used. Because before you wouldn't get any glimpse of it until the court case. I mean, so for me, it was a deciding factor in the Chris Cabba shoot, where everyone was kicking off and everyone was thinking this is going to be another Mark Duggan, it's all going to kick off, we're going to have riots. And so the actual body-worn video footage was released to the family, and they were shown the full footage, and it all quieted down after that. So I don't understand why they don't do this. The same with the situation down in Dorset. If the full footage, not the edited version, had been released, you wouldn't have had any of this stuff going on.
Yeah.
But
well, I've always been a fan of the critical incident briefings that some of the US forces do, where it's not instant, but it's within a good period of time, and the public have got used to that, in that they'll wait for that critical incident briefing in terms of giving the information of what was the call received, what was the officer responding to, what was the nature, what was the body-worn video show. And it's quite a clear caveat at the front of that as well, that say, this isn't to say that that the officer was right, the officer was wrong, etc. This is to inform the public about the situation, and it's still subject to an ongoing investigation, and it calms things down. And as we're seeing more and more, you'll get members of the public, you'll get professional agitators, you'll get professional auditors that will look for police adverse responses because it drives people to the sites, that clickbait stuff, and therefore policing is under a microscope. We need to have the effective tools to combat some of this stuff, because a lie travels around the world before the truth's got its pants on. Policing needs to be in that position where we can say, well, yeah, we were aware of this incident, but here's our footage. We're not saying it's right or wrong, but just look at it for the context. And we also need to be brave enough to say that when we get it wrong, we should be able to put that footage out as well and say this was wholly inappropriate. It has to. You can't just be selective in the way you do it, because people lose trust in the process as well.
No, absolutely. I think that I've always felt quite strongly, given my background, that police comms has to change at a force level. There's always been this, and almost the rise of Twitter and the information that's been passed around, and some would say misinformation in certain cases, that led to far right marches and protests. It's almost, this isn't going to sound, I'll have to qualify this, but it's almost helped in a way, because it's forced the agenda for police forces to have to change. Because I was saying 3 or 4 years ago, when I was at the police federation, we have to change force comms, because so there's a huge incident in an area, the senior police officer that's selected will come out and go, we live in a safe area, this is an isolated incident. It's the same stuff over and over again, and people turn off to it. And then when somebody goes on Twitter and says, this is what happened, they go, wow. And that takes everyone on the journey with them. And what the police officer said is forgotten, because it's just the same stuff. It's just the same thing all the time. And it doesn't, and my view's always been, you've got senior officers saying to comms people, this is what I want to say. And that now you need to empower comms people to say, no, you need to just not play it down, not play it up, just say what happened. Say who is involved. You can't change what's happened. We can't change the incident. We can't change the perpetrator. We can't change the victim. We just need to say what's happened, and then we contain it, rather than trying to pretend something that did happen didn't, or something that didn't happen did. And it's a problem now, but it could have been dealt with a lot better if we go back 4 or 5 years. People were saying it during COVID because there were protests then, and these calls weren't heeded. So it's a really interesting time, actually. So interestingly, the last podcast we had a really good response to it, in terms of Lee and I touched on police officers leaving and saying, well, it was at the time of the Chancellor's spending review, and were people leaving the force because of the money it felt that the Police Federation were just pushing that narrative. So we said, is that true? Are people leaving because of pay? And a lot of the comments we had were about that, and a lot of them were showing that people left for other reasons. So Charlotte Hales on LinkedIn said, I have to correct people regularly about this. I don't know a single person who's left policing due to money. Rather, it was due to culture and leadership issues. At the beginning of this year, I started to self-reference as a police culture survivor. The problems at all levels, not just about senior and chief officers, and sort of continues along that vein. We had Victoria Quinn say 100%, I left due to the politics, unfairness and lack of work-life balance. 25 years in, not look back, best thing I've done. John Ezard said, completely agree with your observations here, Lee. The reasons you cite correct. Once mid-service officers look outside policing, realise the transferable skills that we have, it can unlock far better earning potential, not to mention far less organisational injustice. So it does just show, doesn't it, that people are leaving. It's not because of the money.
Correct. And the organisational injustice aspect speaks to what we spoke about throughout this podcast. Policing is a part of you. It runs deep within every police officer. And it's like I said before, it's like Blackpool through a stick of rock. We hold ourselves to be honest, truthful, accountable people. When that's challenged, especially for something trivial or for something that wouldn't warrant a gross misconduct, when that's challenged and you see the weight of the force and the length of the investigation and the suspicion that they place on you, the suspension, the isolation, all that, you form a deep-seated organisational injustice, and then you just end up thinking, why am I working for this organisation? Nobody in here represents my values anymore. And you look at other opportunities. It's nothing to do with the pay in that regard.
No. Another interesting comment we had on YouTube was, guys, I've donated already to the Break the Monopoly campaign, and this is from Neil Warmby, so thank you, Neil. And when the fund page is back up after the advice, I'm looking to make regular payments each payday. If everyone supports this is a hard one for you. What's the estimate we would need to pay per month to get the target? I mean, obviously, we don't know because we don't know how many people there'd be, but it shows the level of interest there, I guess, Lee, that people are looking to donate monthly.
Yeah, we are looking at other options in terms of automated subscriptions, etc. But as you'll attest, Lobby, you've been running Trojan Wellbeing for 5 years. You've just obtained charitable status as well, haven't you? So congratulations on that. Getting people involved, getting people motivated, and getting and trying to drive that membership or that subscription, it's a real difficulty at times. Hopefully, the breaking the monopoly, and certainly as a result of our conversations here, Lobby, hopefully the Breaking Monopoly campaign will break through some of those barriers around that, and we're looking, as we've spoken, Martin, to streamline the campaign so it's purely focused on funding the legal challenge and not on building a further association. Lobby's doing a great work in that aspect anyway, so there's plenty of other options out there.
Yeah, and I think the main thing is people just having the voice heard. And I think what they've reached now is just complete apathy, where they've been saying these things time and time again for the last 2 decades. I mean, I remember She, and for me that was a turning point in policing, and you could see the demise and the change in sort of like, well, I wouldn't say public sort of trust in policing, but there was certainly government started to turn against policing, and we found we had real battles. I mean, I've got my own sort of theories in relation to what's going on. For me, I think we're just going down the route of it become a private policing organisation, and they're doing what the Chinese would do to a business, where they're destroying the business until it's worthless, and then people step in and start picking up the pieces and start. We've already seen it now where we've got private sort of policing or private security companies cropping up, but when you start to see who's on the boards of these big security companies, and this was one of Theresa May's things. I mean, if you looked, her husband was actually one of the directors on the board for G4S, who were sort of doing quite nicely with some of the tenders that were being put into for the outsourcing that many forces were doing. So it's corrupt, unfortunately, and but our main focus again is just making sure that people who reach out for support are having their voices heard, and this is what we need to be doing with the stuff that the fantastic stuff that you're both doing because I think people are desperate for someone to sort of be their voice.
Brilliant. What a great place to leave it. Look, Steve, thank you very much for joining us. It's been fantastic. We'll have to get you back on because I really enjoyed that. There was some fantastic knowledge and stories there as well. So I think one day we'll just do a podcast, an anecdotal podcast as well, where we can just talk about some great stories.
I need diplomatic immunity for some of the stories I'll come out with, Martin.
We'll do it. We've lost Lee because Lee, about a minute ago, did tell us he only had 2% of his. I know he's back. He's back to say goodbye. We knew Lee, iPad was dying.
No, it wasn't that. Something else happened, and it just kicked me out of the session. But
well, it wasn't me, I promise.
No, never mind.
You need another 50p in the meter, Lee.
I do.
You have got electricity up north now, haven't you? It was being introduced when I left, so you must have.
I've got the kids out on a hamster wheel outside. Let's go and whip them a bit more.
I'm amazed we got through this without my dog barking, because he normally barks about every 10 minutes. So, but it's been really enjoyable. So, Lee, thank you as always, and Lobby, thank you for your time. And as I said, we will get you back on, and look forward to hearing more from you in terms of Trojan Wellbeing, but also as we push forward the campaign to break monopoly. I'm sure your advice and your experience will be invaluable to us. So thank you again.
We've got some major cases coming up which are going to be turning a few things upside down. So yeah, it's going to be.
Well, when you can come on and tell us about them, let us know, and we'll certainly get you back on. So anything we can do to help, we'd love to.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and you're doing fantastic work, Lobby. It's a great community you built, mate. It's a testament to your effort, your perseverance, and just how much you care for policing.
Yeah, it's a beast that we've created. I mean, I'm only 21. Look at the start of me.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you very much, guys, and thank you to our viewers for watching this on YouTube or tuning in on Spotify. We've had some fantastic feedback and some great figures, so we really appreciate your support, and we look forward to recording many of these. So thanks again to Lee and to Lobby, and we'll see you next time on The Rest is Policing.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Yes, that.